Hi, this is Adrienne, and I am going to show you some of the essential things that you need when you are going to begin knitting. So the first thing is your needles. And here I have what I prefer as the circular needles for knitting with. There are many different kinds of needles. Probably the most common that you see for beginning needles are the long straight ones. These ones I feel like are much easier because you don't have so much needle to work with, and your knitting can be carried through on the cable that's connected between the two needles. You can also work knitting back and forth on the needle, or you can work it circular and around. So they're very versatile. And they come in different materials. These ones are metal, which is better for things that you want to slip a little easier, like a wool. Wood ones are easier to use with, say, like a cotton or a silk. And these here are the ones that I really like to knit with. They're an interchangeable cable system where you can take these needles, the ends of these needles off, and switch the size up to another size. You can also add an additional cable if you were doing a very large project like an afghan or a big poncho. You can connect the cables together with a cable connector. They come a lot of times with a cable end cap, so you don't have to worry about putting your needle or your stitches onto a stitch holder. And then they have a little key to tighten and loosen the different pieces on the cables. These are the double pointed needles, which are used for different things in knitting. They're always handy to have. These are crochet hooks, which we don't use to knit with per se, but you can use them for decorative applique after you're done knitting, or a decorative border. The most important thing that you can use them for, though, is if you drop a stitch in your knitting and you want to go back and you pick it up. So those are always handy to have in your knitting case. This is a needle holder, so you can take your needles when you've got a project on your needles and you want to set it down for a while and you don't want your needles to slip off. You slide this in there and then you don't have to worry about it. The next little piece right here are cable needles. These are for making cable stitches in knitting. Not everybody uses those. Sometimes you can just use a double pointed needle to hold your stitching in place where you want it to go. These are nice because the stitches don't slip off the needles as easily. And here we have some smaller pieces. Scissors, of course, for cutting little pieces of yarn. These are stitch markers. A lot of patterns will tell you where to place stitch markers, say at the end of a round or at a place where you're going to be decreasing stitches. And they come in different sizes and different shapes too. A lot of craft stores will have those, and of course any of your local knitting supply store or your local yarn shop. This is a yarn needle, which is used for weaving in yarn ends when you're done with your knitting. Not pointy, very nice to have. And this one is also for threading yarn through, but it's got a pointy end on it, and I like this for using yarn to sew on buttons. These needles won't typically fit through a buttonhole. They're too fat, so this one usually will. So it's kind of handy to have in your knitting pouch also. This is a stitch marker that is used to place on the leg of a stitch because it opens and you can remove it later. Whereas these ones here are used to place directly on the needle, and you slip it from one needle to the next while you're knitting You just slip it over to the next side. This one would be to mark, like, say, where you started a decrease in your knitting, for example, or to keep track of your row counts. And then, of course, you have the yarn. This is a ball of yarn. The label will explain a lot of times what's in the yarn, or it should. This has got wool, silk, and cashmere. It's the color right here. The dye lot is, you know, all of the yarn that's dyed in that lot, which is nice to know if you're knitting a big project so you don't get a shade that's a little different. The weight of the yarn and how many yards are in it are usually on there, which is something that the patterns will usually tell you how much you'll need. And then the gauge, which is a very important thing, and the size of needles. The other thing that, well, and then this yarn here is, this is a skein of yarn. It comes in a long loop that's twisted together, and whoops, you have to unwrap it and stick it on what you call a yarn umbrella, or another word for it would be a yarn, you would use a yarn winder, and then you would wind it into a cake. These are usually from small yarn dyers, a lot of times hand dyed, and they're more of a specialty yarn, but they're very nice to knit with, and they come in all sorts of different fibers. And the last thing here that I have is this knitting gauge. It's a little ruler. Rulers are very essential for your knitting to measure how many stitches you have in so many inches. A lot of gauges say that they use a 4-inch gauge. So they'll say, for example, on this here, it says 18 stitches in 4 inches. So you would knit up a little swatch, and then you would measure it to see if your yarn and needles that you're using match up with the gauge that it calls for. There's also millimeters on this side. And these holes, this is a needle gauge, is used to check to see what size needle you have. So these needles, for example, have no size on them. So I would take this, and I would find which hole it slips through easily. So it's right there. It's the size 10 in the US size, or the size 6 in the European size. Some needles have the sizes written on there. This is US size 6 and a 4 millimeter, but sometimes those numbers rub off. So it's always really nice to have one of these to check your needle size. And that's it. You have this stuff. And oh, there's one other thing. I guess I always like to have a small pouch to keep little supplies in, like this, one that will close and the needles won't fall out of, and one big enough to fit your needles in, and then also a project bag big enough to hold your yarn and your small tools pouch, preferably one that does not have any zippers on it to catch your yarn. If it just has a Velcro, or not a Velcro, if it has a snap closure, that would be the best. And that's it. And hopefully you're ready to start knitting if you have a few of these supplies.